Mr. Murrin, I'm utterly delighted to be able to talk to you today because at the end of our last interview, we touched on the subject of UFOs, and I got a lot of feedback from subscribers about it. And it's a subject that I have spoken about. Well, I haven't spoken about it like you've spoken about it. I've mentioned it in little snippets and clips of things that I've done over the years. And I started mentioning it a couple of years ago when I was still working for Factal Investment Research and writing publications for their subscribers. Because as you know, we've discussed previously, I'm forecasting this downturn to come into 2028 based on the 18-year land cycle. And everybody's always saying to me, what's the trigger for the downturn? And I remember sort of going through COVID, and there was a lot of conspiracy theorists that were coming out and saying that the government was going to plan a fake UFO alien invasion. And they had this kind of number, the number of 2026 would be thrown out a lot. And I remember talking to my co-editor, Callum Newman, who's a subscriber now, and saying to him, wouldn't that be funny if that was the trigger for the downturn? And all the events that have happened since then, I've watched people that have said that they're channeling aliens and all sorts of different snippets and things that have come out. We had the Trump era and the investigation and the open hearings into UFOs. And this date just keeps triggering in my head, and I kept thinking and thinking about it. And we mentioned it in our last interview because it's an area that you've done a lot of research in. And then, of course, hitting the news now are a large number of unidentified objects said to be drones in the northeast of America, littering the sky. And probably like you, and I'll, put this in the blurb and put some videos out when I do it, but there's a lot of videos that are circulating social media that are pretty spectacular. And who else could I discuss this with but you? Because you've done more research on this than anybody else I know. So where do we start with it, David? Where do you want me to start with this interview? I don't even know what first question to ask you. Are these alien ships that we're seeing in the skies? What's going on?
Well, let's go back to, why I'm prepared to talk about it. Because my work at Global Forecaster is really based on a scientific application of logic and the theories I've created about the human cycles of our anti-entropic existence and how we create social structures and how those social structures compete. And essentially, they're anti-entropic, but our survival technique or style is to create added entropy by creating wars that forces lateralization and then perpetuates evolution. So I really do, my work is not founded on sort of lack of substance. On the contrary, as a physicist, I seek substance to explain to people who we are and understand what's happening to us. Now, that model works geopolitically. It examines history. It goes back to as much as history as we can find into what really we have done. Therefore, you can understand why we did it, if it fits into cycles, and therefore start to understand the choices ahead of us so we can break this unconscious cycle and pattern of behavior. And then that's also supported by extensive market studies, which I do in the sort of hedge fund global trader area, which links into it, which really keeps my feet very grounded, because it's lovely to tell stories, but stories have to actually have real ramifications and predictive capabilities to prove that you're on the right track. So that's Global Forecaster. So why am I talking about UAPs to you today? Well, I created a number of mission statements in Global Forecaster. And I'm going to read you the 4 that are relevant and talk about how we've got to this discussion, then we can go into it. So I just going to move it over a bit so I can just read it clearly. There are 4 of them. We at Global Forecaster study cycles within history to locate the position of nations and markets in the present day and then to predict future events. Okay, that's what we do. We seek to present truths, even though they're uncomfortable, and to raise individual and collective consciousness. Well, this topic definitely fits into that category. We seek to confront and expose malign energy wherever it may manifest in human systems. And as you said, if the governments are holding back this information, that definitely fits into this category. We seek to encourage a new balance in lateral and linear thinking to enhance adaptability and maximize human anti-entropy, as in we try to underline and underscore processes that are the most productive choices humanity can make. But to do that, we need all the information. And we seek to share our knowledge to empower readers and subscribers with more realistic ways of understanding our human world and how best to create favorable outcomes, especially with the extreme challenges we face into this W wave entropic peak of 2030, affecting our economic cycles, warfare and human evolution, climate change, and this is the key word, any other topic of significant importance to human evolution.
Mm.
And that is where this topic really lies.
Mm.
So if I now talk about the intersection of what I am aware of this topic to be, my first encounter with it was actually very young. I was fascinated from the earliest age, and my father worked in the aviation industry and was very senior, and therefore many of his friends were chief test pilots and chief operating officers of the big companies like Lockheed and Boeing. So our house was full of senior aviation people. And one of my father's great friends who lived in California was a man called Bill Weaver, who had been the chief test pilot for the US Air Force. And then he went on to be the chief test pilot for Lockheed, which is where they met each other. Now, that's more significant than not when we come on to talk about the topic of the industrial military complex and where technology might have gone and been hidden away and therefore studied. Anyway, being 11, so it was 1974, I was asking about what planes he'd been flying. And when he ran through his planes, he said, well, I stopped flying. I then went to Project Bluebook. And of course, I knew what that was then. Not many did. It was one of the first public US Air Force exposés of the UFO issue. Now, it was never really designed to give us the truth. It was designed to actually hide the truth. So they spent their time explaining away observations by the public as natural phenomena. But I asked him, Bill, can you say anything? I know you can't, but could you say something? And in a way that is really quite unique if you know certain pilots, there was this serious godlike look on his face, and he said, son, not one thing I can tell you is the US Air Force wouldn't be spending all this money on nothing. And that was it. That was like the nod for me. And I've really followed it very closely ever since. But the intersection of where it became a topic to really discuss in public was probably the release in 2017 of the Nimitz videos of what is now known as the tic-tac, an encounter between the Nimitz carrier group and F-18 pilots, which got on like FLIR and radar and Mark 1 eyeballs of 4, members of 2 F-18s, because they're piloted by a co-pilot and a pilot and an operator, weapons operator. This object that essentially was not of this world. And how do I know it's not of this world? It's because its description was massless. It had the ability to accelerate instantaneously, which is something nothing that we could even imagine within our technical envelope is possible. To go from 0 to something of velocities that are hypersonic plus would destroy any living tissue on the inside with like 3,000 Gs. Well, that isn't human. And interestingly enough, it first came out in 2017. It was unofficial. But what has come about is a movement within the US government of highly informed intelligence operatives to disclose what the government really knows. And that disclosure has really been led publicly by Luis Alonso. If you haven't met him, he's a very, very credible, hardcore. You can see he's a product of the US intelligence services over 20 years of counterinsurgency conflict. He's not a flake, he's hardcore. He's very logical. And if you read his book, probably one of the greatest public revelations called Imminent, which I've talked about in my work, it is the greatest public revelation of what really is going on, with him disclosing what he can within the boundaries of his secrecy clauses. So he's a patriot. He refuses to compromise like a normal whistleblower. He's treading a very fine line along with his compatriots. And he left ATIP, which is where he worked for 5 years, heading up the investigation for the Department of Defense into UFOs or UAPs, as they changed the term so that it would have less prejudice attached to it. And essentially, they have been driving releases to Congress, which have led to 3 congressional hearings. And that was paved the way by a piece of legislation at the end of the Trump regime, the last piece of legislation, which opened the way for this particular process. And for those of you not familiar with American budgetary dynamics, everything reports to Congress, all spending patterns, even black programs are meant to report behind closed doors to some sector of Congress. So what these congressional hearings have been doing is bringing into the open this topic. And what has been revealed in the space that we can see publicly, because obviously you have to have behind closed doors hearings, is that the question really isn't, do they exist? The question is, what are they doing? Because the evidence is overwhelming, whether it's the footage from the tic-tac, another sighting, which is from the Roosevelt in 2014-15 of gimbal or go fast. There are massless objects that consistently accelerate from 0 to hypersonic speeds almost instantly, are transmedium, as in they can go from space to air to water completely without impediment. And they are seen absolutely regularly by the military. And that brings us into this really other interesting overlap, is the topic of UAPs doesn't stand alone, as in a curiosity as to whether we are alone or not or being interacted. It also seems to very much overlap, in my opinion, with human warfare. Now, if we go back to the topic of my latest book, which is Breaking the Code of Wars, I postulate that war is an integral part of human evolution, that essentially we compete with each other as human social systems in an anti-entropic strategy to be the most lateral and adaptive. And we've come up with a cunning plan of adding another layer of entropy, which is trying to kill each other. But what it does is it forces societies to essentially become more adaptive and more lateral. All you've got to do is look at the extent of adaptation that the Ukrainians have gone through to counter a larger threat in the form of Russia. Russia may have size, but it's far less adaptable and far less lateral than the Ukrainians per se, which has allowed them, with support from the West, to stay in the game. If you go to the Ukrainian military, it will be a thoroughly adapted, lateralized structure right now. Even the Russians will have adaptations like that, as war has forced the lessons upon them. And what is interesting is new technology arises from those conflicts. And then in the time of peace, the dominant entity sort of continues in a lateralized form for many decades, which creates peaceful advancement. But my thesis is that we use wars socially to evolve. And those wars have a rhythm to them. We've talked about the rhythm. And it, was first uncovered or alluded to by Kondratieff. I now call them W waves because really it's a 112-year cycle with an intermittent half cycle. And the half cycle is a Cold War, more like the Cold War we had in the mid-70s into the peak, or the Cold War between Napoleon III and Britain when Palmerston's Follies were built, which most people don't know about, or a Cold War that went hot in the case of the 7 Years' War, which involved the great powers of France and Britain in a more contained way fighting for the world, which was repeated in the Napoleonic War. And every 112 years, we trigger some way or another a hegemonic conflict which reshuffles the deck so that the system that comes out is vibrant, even if the systems that went in were old and sequescent. So warfare is a cyclical endeavor for humanity. And we'll call them W cycles, just so we understand war cycles. So understanding war is to understand human evolution. And part of that process is the really interesting question of why we have these pulses of entropy, as I call them, that force us to evolve. Because we've always been warlike and competitive, but something happens every 112 years that means that we literally take up our pitchforks and we just make sure we fight. And we are in that process now, which is why I can't be optimistic that it's suddenly going to go away with a Trump negotiated package, because the peak isn't until 2030. So in that process, the pulse keeps getting stronger and everything gets worse until it's resolved. Is China going to be the dominant hegemon going forward for the next century, or is democracy going to survive? Until that question is really answered by one winning and one losing, the job isn't done, having pulled the starting trigger on this hegemonic cycle. So from that perspective, let's look at humanity in a very different evolutionary phase, that essentially war is our evolutionary mechanism. So is it really a surprise that these craft with occupants, but they may not be occupants. They may well be biological AIs. We don't know what actually is in them, but there is a sentience observing us. And if we were to observe ourselves with that knowledge, we would monitor extremely closely our warfare evolution because it measures how far we can go. And any race across the universe will have got to a stage where it cracked the atom and it created fissionable warheads and it created fission fusion systems, which created what we call fusion bombs, which are our biggest explosive destructive capability. And it is no coincidence that essentially since the First World War, there is a trace of interaction. In the First World War, these objects were called airships, but they weren't airships. But they were perceived as airships in the technology and the perception of the day. In the Second World War, bomber streams in both the Pacific and across Germany encountered what were called Foo Fighters, which exhibited very similar qualities of massless movement that we would describe today in one of the observables outlined by Luis Alonso that describes consistently what UAPs look like, as in they're massless, they can accelerate, they're transmedium, they have low observability. They also have biological effects on people where their encounters with them are not always good, and they end up with lasting effects, perhaps because of the favorite theory behind it is they sit in what we would call, if you're a Star Trek fan, a warp bubble, which distorts space and allows them to move so freely and negates the effect of their mass, which actually is a topic which I've written about on my website. Now, all of this and the things I'm talking about, I've released in 8 Murrinations, which are designed to really bring the reader up to speed with what we know about this phenomena. This phenomena is not necessarily benign. So let's just look at the tic-tac and the go fast and the gimbal and where they were spotted. They were spotted following carrier groups. Carrier groups in the States leave the West Coast and the East Coast and they work up in waters off the coasts. And they all carry nuclear weapons per se on their deployments. So they are targets. And one of the high correlations of this process is that UAPs are drawn to nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons production facilities, which we call power plants, where the piles generate uranium and they generate fissionable material in terms of plutonium in fast breeder reactors, like the ones the Chinese are now accelerating as they want more ICBM warheads. So essentially, we've got a correlation here. And the first correlation that really showed up is in the Second World War, we saw these Foo Fighters. And the Foo Fighters were on the tips of bombers. But what isn't talked about is from the time Los Alamos and the Manhattan Project turned the pile on, there were UFOs sighted around the buildings. There were UFOs sighted from that point onwards in the tests in the Pacific. And most importantly, and this is probably the milestone that we can go back to fairly reliably, that the Roswell crash in 1947 was real. And one of the great revelations of Luis Alonso in his book is that he said it was a real event. Now, when you get a senior DoD intelligence official who's come from a program writing a book telling you that Roswell is real, it's no longer an investigative journalist who's spoken to witnesses and has concluded. It is a de facto reality that something crashed in the desert in Roswell along with alien bodies, one of which supposedly was alive. But what's really interesting is it wasn't just randomly in a piece of desert. It was right next to the 105 bomber group. They flew Stratofortresses, and they were the squadron that dropped the bombs in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. They were the only nuclear-capable US bomber force. And therefore, they were the elite of what was soon to be, just afterwards, the Air Force, as it moved away from the Army Air Force to the US Air Force. They were the elite personnel. And yet, just to describe this encounter, the base commander and the intelligence officer went to the crash site, reported on local television they had found a flying saucer with 4 bodies, materials in the flying saucer that were nothing like they'd seen, like aluminium that you crumpled and regained shape, and numerous other things. Now, what does it take for someone of that observer status to come onto television to make a statement like that, to then refute it the day later and call it a weather balloon, which is completely different? So at the time, it's always perceived to be in a cover-up. And I think that was really a critical moment from there was an alleged letter between Eisenhower and Churchill in the war talking about Foo Fighters and they couldn't be disclosed, which is floating around. But the Roswell incident seems to be the point at which reverse technology that we know of got into the hands of the US Air Force, and Truman came up with policies that quite rightly hid them, because you could understand in 1947, if you talked about aliens, the fabric of our society could have collapsed very readily. There were far more religious people, far more constructs that were rigid that held society together than perhaps we would find today. So I can understand why that was done. But there was also another process. The Cold War had started. And there's an element to UFOs and UFOs recovery, which is some form of competition between agencies like the Russians, the Chinese, and the Americans that all have reverse engineering programs. And that's another thing Louis Alondra talks about. America has one, Russia has one, China has one. So there is a black arms race in the deciphering of whatever crashed craft that come into the hands of these nations are recovered, hidden from the public, and reverse engineered. And Alonso's assertion is that it's been kept from Congress and the president and the constructs of government, because if they knew about it, it would get out over 70 years. And it's been put into the military industrial defense complex, where it's been hidden and reverse engineered slowly and gradually because the technology was so different from our own. Now, there are numerous reports of this, and there are numerous assertions of it that sit firmly within the category of, very possible. Alonso's statements have taken the possible into under oath statements in Congress, in written material from witnesses that, you cannot disparage in any shape or form. So we're now into this status where everyone should really get real and actually start to go and look at the congressional hearings, get to grips with exactly that they are here. They are around us. And what is interesting is the number of sightings is increasing. In the Cold War, when the tensions increased, there were numerous sightings around missile silos like Maelstrom, where people on site reported UFOs over the top of the missile silos, turning them on and off. The Russians had the same issues. So they have been interacting with us. And some people consider that to be lesser warning and more a threat. Now, if you're paranoid, you should. But in a world that's already on a trigger hair, to have these objects flying around, which, we don't really know what they are in air defense spaces, whether it's Russian, Chinese, or American, is a security threat. Because at what stage do you think it's an advanced technology the Chinese have got one over us, and we'll go to the drone issue in a bit, or whether it's alien UAPs with a different agenda, is difficult to discern at times of tension. So the overlap is definitely there. And there are other areas too. For example, the tic-tac, gimbal and go fast. It's one video amongst weeks and weeks of engagement. There are clusters of these UAPs that swarm in the distances around carrier task groups in what are meant to be secure areas. And the case of the Roosevelt even then followed them all the way to their deployment in Iraq. So then there's an interesting question of what are they really doing? They don't stop anyone. It's almost like they do two things. They're riding shotgun in some way with an agenda we don't understand. They are prepared to be seen when they have the ability not to be seen. So they're transmitting something in the process of doing that. And as the interaction with the F-18s in the tic-tac, and David Favor talks about this, and there's more and more really detailed components of the story, which I've lifted from various eyewitness accounts or their stories of them, is that this UAP in question interrogated David Favor, was telepathic, and understood what's called his cap point, where the patrol of two F-18s would return to in a geometric position above or around the carrier. And after their head-on-head engagement, it just suddenly went there. And the radar controller on the Princeton, both the pilots expressed extreme shock because only they knew where that cap point was. So the UAP was able to read the mind of the pilot and then go to that point. So we've got telepathic interactions taking place. We've got interactions where they actually engaged the F-18 before it didn't. And the initial interesting point about it was the thing that drew the F-18 pilots to this particular tic-tac was a massive circle of frothy water that he described, suggesting something was under it that was massive. And above that, the tic-tac. And that leads on to an equally, but a really opaque area of this topic. And that is whatever we are seeing in the skies in the form of objects in space as well, because the reports are that the UAPs and the tic-tacs were moving in and out of space above the Nimitz, not just locally, and that in fact other sensors pick them up, is what's going on under our oceans and the number of reports of incredibly fast moving objects, 300 plus knots that are picked up on sonars underwater that are encountered means that there's something also going on in our oceans. Now, it's easier for navies to keep that quiet, and every submarine with a sophisticated sonar must be subject to the Secrets Act, because if it is as prevalent as we're led to believe, then essentially all countries will have some evidence of things moving faster than they should do. So we are in a domain, and there's a story actually, which, I mean, at the time I was just stunned when I heard it. And that was not unique now that more and more of these stories are coming out. But I was doing some work for a very colorful gentleman who had gone into Afghanistan to support the Mujahideen before the CIA had even arrived. And he had been chased for 3 years and he had part of the training program. Ultimately, he got shot after being chased by the Spetsnaz and ended up back home, and he built a big oil business, which is why we were over there at the time. And he had gone drinking with a Russian general who was backing his cause, and in had come the Russian Spetsnaz general who'd been hunting him. And of course, vodkas flowed, and it was a jolly occasion, and they shared stories. And then another gentleman came in, and he happened to be a senior admiral of the Russian fleet who had commanded a Russian missile boat, or BUMO as we call it. And he started raising the topic of what is the strangest thing that's happened to you in your life. And they each recounted their story. His story was remarkable. He was on patrol in the Arctic under the ice, and all of the instruments of the submarine went crazy. So they surfaced the boat, broke the ice. He went on deck, and above him was a mile-wide UFO. Now, I asked the question. This is probably one of the most mile-wide, yes, giant UFO, a mothership. Which again, I first started hearing about them. I thought, well, that's a bit weird. But there are cases, for example.
Is this the picture that Louis? There's a picture floating. He described it as a mothership. Is that the one that you're talking about? That it was described as a mothership or something?
I haven't seen this picture, but they're giant UFOs.
Yeah.
They're huge. And there have been intermittent reports all over about them, which are hard to get your fingers on. There is a case in the 80s of a JAL 747 Japanese Airlines that was flying across the Atlantic from west to east. And first of all, they saw two objects, and then this giant thing turned up on their wingtip. So that it's not unique, and I hadn't heard of them before. But I go back to this case. There's a man, the most stable human being by psychology you would expect, because no one gets to be a missile boat commander having the future of mankind in their hands without having extreme qualities of stability. And yes, he was subject to vodka, but that was his reminiscence of his most extreme experience. And it fits very much into the category of water, nuclear weapons, and UFOs. And so they are drawn to it in some shape. Now, Louis Alondra and other people claim that the Roswell incident was actually the saucer brought down by an EMP from a nuclear test. I've heard other stories about similar things happening. I find it quite hard that a technology that has created a warp bubble actually could be affected by an EMP, but that's another matter. We do need to ask the question, as if these crashes are real, which we now should assume they are, is why does a sophisticated piece of technology drop out the sky and crash? And, it sounds a bit more than Boeing's left the door lock open and didn't have the right technology. It sounds like there's either something we do, as they claim EMPs, which I find hard to believe, because surely that bubble should insulate them. And secondly, something else brings them down, which would suggest there's competition. And that's a question. Maybe it isn't as simple as we think it is. Maybe it isn't one race or one interested party, and they have an agenda too. All of that leads to the point that the more we know, much as it may be very difficult, the more we can adjust and adapt to whatever our real reality is.
The comments that I've seen going around on this, and I listened to a very long Joe Rogan podcast on it, where he kind of put this theory forward that if they wanted to get us used to the fact that UFOs are real, because that's what you're saying. You're saying, okay, they've been around for so long, you know, we've had numerous sightings of them, and right up until very recent times, it's been kept as a theory, not a reality. So in the human concept, we have seen it that if you believe in UFOs, it's a bit of a conspiracy theory, and pulling away the physical reality of what happens with the UFO from the conspiracy is quite hard, because you've got a lot of stories of people saying that they've been abducted by aliens, and you know, like I said, people that think that they can channel aliens or whatever else. You know, they're the ET. You know, we have the film ET. I mean, it's all this kind of imaginary thing, and because in recent times, you know, it's become more real. And now you're saying, okay, they've been around for ages. And his idea was, well, you know, maybe this is a way of, we can't hide it anymore. We've got to get you used to it. And suddenly we're seeing all of these UFOs, they're kind of dripping them in, that we're seeing more and more sightings in order to get humanity back to the point that they are here, because I'm assuming that they've interacted. If they've caught, you know, we've got Area 51 in America, and if they've caught UFOs and if they've had interaction with aliens, then I'm assuming that they must have a better concept about what this is all about than we do.
Well, you've talked, there are lots of topics on here, so we've got to just like strip it out. The first thing is, if you were the keeper of this secret from 1947 onwards, and let's assume there was no evidence prior to the Roswell crash, then you would be left confronted with a reality that one day you knew you had to share with your population, that at this stage would break society's religious constructs, national constructs, and maybe remove so much of our motivation as the alpha predators of the planet, believing that we control our destiny. So one of the things I think we have seen is, through science fiction, we have seen the seepage of ideas that essentially make it more acceptable for us to think that we're not alone, whether it was Star Wars, whether it was the whole AI process in Battlestar Galactica in the early 70s. We have seen a string of concepts that actually, for if you are a science fiction fan, have opened our minds to numerous possibilities. And, you know, June Roddenberry, for example, with the warp bubble that allowed the Enterprise to travel at super light speed. Well, that's interesting, because these things definitely have a bubble around them. So that bubble, you know, could be called a warp bubble that distorts time and space and allows instantaneous movement, which is what it was in Star Trek. So I think it's quite interesting if we were to really do an examination, a forensic examination. One of the things that, you know, I work with the Global Forecaster model is looking at mosaics of small pieces of information that have patterns and therefore have bigger truths. That's how I picked up the cycles of humanity, and all my theories are based on it. So if we apply those theories to what is in the public domain through Hollywood film productions, and let's assume it's been, you know, carefully leaked in the evolution of our thought process, within the construct of what we see already will be a reality that they're trying to communicate with us. So that's one area that's really worth considering when you watch science fiction, is what element is being communicated that may well be real, or, you know, that we needed to know to get to the next stage. So the next part of this is, have they already interacted with us? There are, you know, rumors, and there are rumors of interaction already, some kind of pact. Now, a pact would suggest working together, and working together suggests working against someone else. So that would suggest that what we are familiar with on our planet of a split between hierarchy and democracy, self-enablement and be a cog in a bigger wheel, which is essentially our two leadership processes, is in some way echoed outside our realm of the planet, and there are champions for each side working against each other. Possibility. Can't rule it out. Enough quietness. I think there is another option, which, you know, probably if you had to give me which one do you think at the moment, is, having studied these entropic pulses that generate catalytic and entropic events that force our evolution. My first observation was, we are being forced to evolve. We're being forced to evolve because of the regularity of these pulses that creates the regularity of these W cycles and hegemonic conflict. Well, why would you be forced to evolve? Because actually something else is forcing us. So perhaps we are a forced experiment. There are discontinuities in our history. which we still can't answer. For example, at 50,000 BC, how is it that our language gene triggered to make us, in the war of the hominids, as I call it, the dominant Homo sapien species over Neanderthals, Devonians? What was it that triggered it after 2.5 million years of wandering around? Why that moment? We like to think it was climate duress, but there is a point of our evolution that's relatively young, that it really is the foundation of what makes us different, which is language, communication, and therefore shared experience that can be passed on through generations. And when you develop a spear thrower, all the tribes in the region learn how to make a spear thrower, unlike the poor Neanderthals who could talk amongst themselves but didn't share between tribes, we think. So there's an event there that's really interesting. And then if you just look at our historical record, there is something wrong with it. We can very clearly see the evidence of 3000 BC forwards, but there is something that happened afterwards that's opaque to us. Why did the Sumerians, for example, just appear with the city Ur, which is gridded with high technology, and no clear string as to how that evolved in prior organizations or dwellings or cities? How is it that the Sphinx is water weathered, which takes it back to at least 11 BC? That's 10,000 years older than people think it should be. Or the temple behind it is water weathered, or the spatial geometry of the Great Pyramid. I mean, which is truly beyond imagining that it could have been made by anything but a group of people with a very high knowledge of the Earth's proportions and astronomy, something that certainly the Egyptians shouldn't have had. And then, of course, there's a discontinuity of the Younger Dryas, which was a huge climatic upheaval, which people are beginning to discover of pre-civilization and post-civilization. So there's a discontinuity there. And there's also a reference, for example, through our continuum of what we write off as, ancient gods or assumptions, but there are common mechanisms that go across continents that shouldn't have had that communication. So there's a question about our past, is how long has this really been happening? But that's in some ways to be put aside. I think we have to, that's another examination that we have to be open-minded to, but there's just not enough evidence at the moment, apart from something isn't right, that we need to look more closely at. And the whole historical rigidity that we've created in our stories, which academically is reinforced, needs to be challenged with the help of earth sciences, like, for example, geology, looking at the Sphinx and water weathering, to say, whatever your story is, I think it's not quite right, because the evidence is very clear here. So we've got a past thing to look at, which we still have to look at in parallel, but we've got this very real thing right now as we're coming into the peak of this entropic cycle into 2030, where I argue we're in World War III with all the ramifications. And with that is coming an increase in sightings, as it did in the peak of the Cold War. So what does it look like, and how can we perhaps think about this a little bit? Well, the drones that we've had over the UK and the drones we've had over the US seem to have a number of components. One of the components is, in UFO law, sightings of objects by individuals have sometimes been accompanied by helicopters chasing them if they were slow moving across the landscape. That goes back to the 70s. But we don't use helicopters anymore. We use drones. So, and you have to assume that there are bigger drones than the ones we see, and possibly those bigger drones are the size of cars buzzing around, making a noise. And they're actually the drones that the US defense agencies are sent out to scour for something that is actually genuinely a UAP. And there are enough of them around, and have been, to cause trouble. The fact they're over military bases is another one of these trigger signs that it's actually what's going on is, possibly consistent with UAP observables with nuclear weapons, like the bases in the UK in the northeast, which are basically all nuclear bomber bases, like Brentwater's, where one of the great UFO sightings took place in the 80s.
Yeah.
So I think it's probably a combination. I think there's a security issue where they try to hunt them down. There's an increased observable phenomena as the tensions rise. There are all sorts of parts to it which probably are layered. But again, it shows you the interface between the security concerns, because any one of these stages, when objects appear in our airspace, our first concern is, have the Chinese or Russians done something that we can't do? And bear in mind, they've created hypersonic weapons before us, and hypersonic weapons that travel around the globe and drop out like prompt strike. They're years ahead of us. that actually is a concern. There is a piece of technology for the Americans and NATO allies that actually we don't have. So that's a crossover. And you're always asking the question, have they broken massless travel? If they have, we're finished, because that technology is so beyond anything we have in terms of the energy required and the technology to do it. Whoever has that wins the world. So that brings back the next issue is no, I don't think they're here to invade us in the short term, because if they wanted to, they would have done it. It's much more subtle in terms of what's playing out, whether it's an evolutionary process that forces us to be something else for some purpose we don't understand, that we really do need to understand, to be fair. Whether it's some cosmic interplay between, an extension of individuality versus collectivism, democracy versus autocracy. Well, we're having that play out on Earth right now, and that hasn't changed. So that's certainly one possibility. But whatever it is, it's very, very, very serious. And it goes to the heart of who we are and who we can be and the freedoms we have in choice or not to be. You mentioned about, the abductions and what you didn't touch on is the cattle mutilations. And abduction theory is something I've always sort of put at the back of my category of interest. And I always thought about the cattle mutilations as possible not. But actually, the details that have come out recently are really quite spectacular. That all of these creatures are exsanguinated, as in there is no blood, just disappears. And then the surgical precision with parts of their bodies, including anuses and ears, which seems weird, are removed, and the rest of it is left there. And that something happens is that whatever's happened to the carcass, like animals don't eat them afterwards. They sense that something isn't right about it. So, and it's happening on a scale which is really significant. So the bit that Imminent also talked about was a little creepy when they talked about alien implants, which Alonso talked about as being real phenomena.
Yeah.
And until his book, the image of an alien implant was really something the size of a little metal tic-tac found somewhere in the body and removed. But he described something which I found a little bit concerning when I heard it, was these objects had a number of qualities. One of them was that they could move through flesh without creating damage as surgeons tried to remove them. So they were conscious of the attempt to remove them. And then when they were removed, they had hair-like, structures which were embedded in the person. Now, that definitely made me shiver because it moves to the point of experimentation. It moves to the point of control. Where is one and not the other taking place? And the other thing that he mentioned, and there's, in UFO law, this whole thing about Skywalker Ranch, which is, has been studied extensively. He mentioned there is a high link between other phenomena that we would call sort of creepy phenomena and the UAP phenomena. So the idea of psychic, the idea of things happening were real. And he recounted something which, again, made me shiver, and it's called the hitchhiker effect, in which the scientists that had studied Skywalker Ranch and its phenomena took phenomena home with them. And in his case, he reported that as they started to look into UAPs in a different way, he had orbs in his house. He had dark, wolf-like creatures in his backyard, noises on his stairs, and it lasted for months and months, which he said was very common to other people that engaged in that process. So that it's a lot more than the physical, it would seem. And, I was quite taken aback at someone, again, of his stature, talking about the whole mechanism that we see there, which, again, perhaps alludes to why in the past, maybe they haven't just been aliens in spacesuits who come down like gods. Maybe they have manifested in other ways, which other cultures truly consider to be ethereal and godlike. But whatever it is, where we think we are, who we think we are, doesn't really fit with the evidence of what we're experiencing. And that's really why I raised the topic with you and for listeners, is we have more questions than answers, but we do have governments like the States that have the answers or much greater levels of answers. And I think it's time that basically they did reveal, however bad it is. I mean, imagine there's a film called Jupiter, which I often think of. It's a great little film, and it's about the families of planets that own other planets, and they basically wait until they get to a certain level and they harvest all 7 billion people at once and take their life energy and they sell it. And I remember thinking, great story. I thought, oh shit, maybe we do have some pretty bad versions of what this experimentation structure looks like. But I do know this is that we need to understand what we deal with. We need to understand whether war is something that we actually do ourselves. Now, we know we fight and we know we're aggressive, but I ask a question, and I honest, it's just a question. Is everything we've done at our own driving, our own like mechanism? And if it isn't, then something else is playing a part in our history and evolution that we should know about.
Mm. The war's an interesting one. It reminds me of going back in biblical times, to the story of Cain and Abel, the two brothers that fought against each other, and one was the harvester of land, so he'd enclose the land, and the other one was the one who went hunting and gathering, and the Georgist, or the economic narrative that always came out around that, with the people that I mixed with, which was this idea that once you enclose land and you form territory, you have to defend it. And then that obviously, leads into war, and the war between two brothers was a part and parcel of that. But you've touched on so much in the...
Catherine, that is such an interesting example, because the moment that you said it, my vision is they represent two brothers in the transition of human evolution from the lateral hunter-gathering to the more linear agrarian process, which requires cyclical return to a mechanism. So in fact, it encapsulates what I talk about, which is one of the human collective dynamics of lateral versus linear in its essence at the beginning. And that is one of the processes that makes us very unique, I would argue, is that we've got these two thoughts, ways of thinking, which oscillate as we go through organizational cycles, systems created by lateral warrior type mindsets that are then like enshrined and institutionalized by linear collectivity, and which then lack adaptability as that side then takes control of everything into decline, and the creative elements can't reassert themselves. So you then impose a conflict to readjust the balance. So the warrior lateral nature then takes hold of society for another pulse forwards. And in that story is really fascinating, because that's how I observe us as a human race evolving. And I think that process is being manipulated and accelerated with these W cycles. And the question is there a natural drive towards it? Well, I can't find one. And I think when you take this whole UAP interaction with conflict and nuclear weapons especially, and there's perhaps a reason why, is if we are an experiment, they don't want us to blow ourselves up. They want us to get the experiment beyond the point where we have nuclear weapons and make stupid decisions. So maybe actually they are actually running shotgun on our nuclear facilities because they don't trust us not to make the right decisions. Now, there is no evidence that someone's tried to use a nuclear weapon and had it turned off. But maybe that's what this is. It's like a nuclear shotgun program. And it's not because they love us. It's because they're running an experiment that needs to get through a watershed. And the watershed is self-destruction before the next level of our evolution, which we don't fully understand.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because I have actually heard that, when I was digging around, and listening to various interviews and everything, because I knew we had this discussion coming up. There was someone that had put that theory forward, and he'd put that theory forward based on, he said, a document that was disclosed by government, and that the reason that they were here was because they were concerned about the level of nuclear weapons that we have, and it was getting to a point where our wars were risking destroying Earth, and they were here to prevent that happening, which I thought was quite interesting. I mean, there's so much in what you've said. It's, when you're talking about you talk about that film Jupiter, my vision was, when you're talking about aliens being implanted in people, is the film Alien, which anybody that watched when they were younger, was utterly terrifying at the time.
Actually, I find there's another film, which is Predator, which is very entertaining. Yes. But basically, what that particular race is doing is stressing itself through hunting, and therefore evolving through this entropic process to become better. So much as you look at it and go, that's a great little piece of science fiction, what it really is emulating is how we evolve collectively through conflict. And then we make ourselves stronger and better as a result of it. So, all of these things, I think, have threads that we need to be mindful of as possibilities. And we need to be very open-minded, and we mustn't be dogmatic, and there is a conspiracy. There are parts of the system which has held back information. And I suspect the information they're holding back is not nice information for us. I think if it was purely, does the fabric of society have enough resilience to survive this piece of news? I think we do right now. I really do. So why is it not being shared? Why did Reagan and Gorbachev talk about coming to each other's aid if they were invaded by aliens? I mean, a well-documented clause between two presidents. So there are dynamics here which I think, again, are probably going to be very hard for the alpha predator on the earth as we think of ourselves to realize that we're actually a bunch of beta second degreeers, but we also have the potential, like all systems, to grow further than we think. And I just think it's important to be open-minded about this and to follow the threads which are now being presented to us in the most remarkable form by the disclosure movement in the States, and to get up to speed with it.
A few areas we need to sort of push this discussion into, but of course, I mean, with the advent, you talk about the number of sightings increasing during the Cold War. Now, of course, when you get an increased number of sightings, it can't be hidden anymore because of social media and TikTok. I mean, within seconds, the videos have got millions and millions of views. And the sightings that I've seen of these UFOs have been really remarkable. I mean, news cameras have gone out and taken videos of them, which have been very good. And, some of the drones, they look like rocks that are circulating. Some of them look like domes. And outside of all of that, I mean, I guess the question is
by the way, there's an image of this blue orb on Manchester Airport, and it was taken by a flight crew, and it went up and hovered and went up. I mean, it is surreal. If that image is real, and again, in the days of Photoshop, you have to ask, it looks truly like we never made it. It really does. And there was an image, there's a program on Prime. It's called The Program 2024. And it's basically about the journey to the congressional hearings and the process. Everyone should watch it. But in it, there's a hidden, the program, 2024 on Prime. And in it, there is a picture. And there was a picture of a flying saucer taken in the UK in the 80s by two walkers that hid under a tree. Somehow they preserved one of these pictures, and all the others were taken by MOD people that came to interrogate them and intimidate them. And there is very clearly a massive great object, and there is a Harrier underneath it. And it is a surreal picture. And from everything that people like Lewis talk about, there are numerous and massive numbers of data sets out there that could be released to suggest that ATIP, that the tic-tac was just the drop in the ocean. And I suspect every carrier group that works up on the east and west coast goes through this cycle to this day. I don't think it's one-off. I suspect it's a regular event now.
But the point is about this, though, is that the event can't be hidden anymore. And somehow this information has got to come out. And is this part of it coming out in a controlled way, or is this out of their control in so much as whatever operates the ships is in control, whatever operates the...
Well, I don't think this is, whatever agency has held this information, I think it's unlikely that this agency still wants to have it released. I think that the group around Luis Alonso and Chris Mellon, who are all senior DoD people, basically are pushing against a system that doesn't want to. And as Alonso described, one of the biggest problems he faced were fundamental Christian officers in the DoD who believed it was demonic and therefore should never be looked at. And interestingly enough, I suspect there is a sort of inter-service rivalry process taking place between the Navy that have got left out of this mechanism and the US Air Force that obviously was first on site in Roswell and since then has had to preserve. After all, the US Air Force has all the most sophisticated sensor systems, whether they're space-based or whether they're land-based. And even when these F-18s are operating in places like, for example, the West and East Coast, but especially the East Coast, there are Air Force F-22s with far more sophisticated radar systems that would have been up at the same time. And there's not a glimpse of reports But interestingly enough, there are more and more reports of Air Force missile silo operators. There's one called Juliet 7 that came out, which goes back to 2014, of two operatives who saw this UFO right over Juliet 7 as a missile base. They're consistent and regular. And so this is not just a one-off phenomenon. We're getting glimpses of information, like, 1 in 100 of the mosaic, and we're piecing together the story from that. But there's far more data points out there to be released. So I just suggest everyone stays very open-minded and based in science, based in observation, and based in the quality of the observer information we're given. When a senior military person like David Favor, who was, head of his squadron in F-18, reports what he saw, right? This guy has got everything to lose, and he's an extremely credible observer, as is his backseater, as is the plane alongside him, as is the radar operator on the Princeton at the same time. These are not just people that woke up after having a drug-induced dream and told a story. There's a huge substance behind it, especially when they appear on radar, FLIRs, infrared, like lock-on systems for missiles. It's real-world stuff. So I strongly urge people to start thinking differently from not do they exist, but basically they do exist, and what is happening to us.
But that's the essential question, isn't it? I mean, it's the essential question for, okay, they exist and there's all the spiritual ideas of it. And I think I touched on this in the last one. I mean, I've had a lot of, I had a near-death experience when I was in my 20s. So I briefly crossed over and for the first time realized that we don't die, and went through this whole kind of spiritual revelation. So I've always been very open-minded to all of this ideas and phenomena. And it really did kind of transform my understanding. I was brought up in a very religious family, and that never would have had a bar of any of that. So my beliefs kind of shifted very considerably at that time. And I think it shaped the work of everything I do. It shapes the stuff that I write about at Land Cycle Investor, because I talk a lot about astrocycles. And, I also believe that it's important that, I think like you, I think you have an inner passion and an inner urge to share your warning for the world, which is, why do we have these cycles? Why do we have wars? And how can my family thrive and be happy? Because at the base of all of this, and this is what I'm trying to get to in this roundabout way, is that my subscribers are concerned about, we want to enjoy our lives with our families, and we live in this system which is bound to booms and busts in the economy because of how it's being constructed and because of how it's been set up. And now we've got the threat of war and what that's going to do to commodity prices, which is what you talk about. And we learn through our own evolution that wars are all about territory and land and the fight for the powers and technology that fueled our nations. And now suddenly this extra factor has come in. And the one thing people are going to want to know is, to put it in no other term, what's it going to do to the markets? What's going to happen if suddenly we get, I mean, is that what we're looking at? I mean, is it that we're being slowly immersed into it in a way that it's not going to spook anybody, and we're going to become used to seeing these objects, realize they're not a threat, and somehow it's just going to become part of?
Well, one of the things I think that over the period of my official global forecaster role, I'm constantly amazed at the way our human systems really, really act like sheep. So the sheepdog is barked, and the sheep look up and they see the wolves on the fence, and they look at the wolves, and the wolves aren't moving. And the sheepdog stops barking, so they get back to eating their grass. And that is exactly how we collectively behaved over the pandemic, when it was clear, and if I was able to work out in November it was coming and warn everyone, why didn't everyone else? Because they wanted to eat their grass. It was very clear that Putin was going to invade Ukraine, but why did they deny it? Because they wanted to eat their grass. So one of the dangers that we face is not looking up, is not actually looking up and thinking, the wolf may not move now, but when he moves, he'll move so quickly, I'll have my mouth full, and that will be the end. And so if we want to be secure in a world that's full of human uncertainty, it's full of environmental uncertainty to a lesser degree, and now we have this added spectrum of, who are we? Are we independent? Are we tampered with? Are we shaped? Then we need to look up. And that doesn't mean we change our day-to-day existence. I mean, I think we can't have an investment policy for full disclosure that UAPs are real. I don't think that's possible. Even that is beyond even my ability to work out how we deal with it. But what we can do is we can have an investment policy which understands where everyone else's psychology is right now and what are the most likely outcomes. The most likely outcomes are greater entropy into 2020, 2030, greater conflict with China making its move, commodity prices surging, and one of the only places you really want to be in is gold and silver, because I think Bitcoin is over because of another dynamic, which is quantum computing is going to break blockchain. And it's not long before that happens, trust me. And that leads me to something else, which is,
When you say, can you explain it? Because people are going to ask me, because I listen again, I think this was touched upon in a Joe Rogan interview. I've been listening to his stuff lately, but he was talking about this, that quantum computing is just going so vastly and so fast.
so,
We actually don't
so
know what the future is, you know, in
well, okay, so let's just look at this quantum revolution. I remember studying quantum mechanics in my physics classes, and it was probably the biggest mind fuck, pardon my language, we studied. This idea that the observer changed the outcome, this idea that this atom, in a Newtonian sense, sat in position X, but that was just your maximum probability distribution of a Schrodinger function, was just took ages to get our heads around. Now I think you can explain to people far quicker because it's embedded in society that quantum mechanics has validity. But what we now see is quantum engineering, the interaction of computers which can relate the upstate and downstate into infinite number of states in a qubit and store information. It is staggering to think what we're doing to do that. And there are some 15 to 20 quantum computers of different designs operating. They're gradually crawling up the qubit curve. Yes, there are challenges, but these things are as different from the best analog computers we have now to an abacus. That's the jump. They understand the universe because they replicate the universe's process. So when it comes to material science advances, instead of asking an algorithmic computer which makes approximations, a quantum computer is the structure of the universe. Therefore, it will see things completely differently. And what we're also seeing is a quantum sensing shift between, for example, quantum gravity, quantum magnetics. Now, a really good quantum gravity sensor is going to turn every submarine into a target because you can see through the bottom of the oceans and you can see the change in gravity that the submarine represents. These sensors are ground changing, and the weapons that we go into our great wars with are never the weapons we come out of. There are always new systems that supersede it. And one of the weapons we're going into that's considered the queen of the seas is the submarine. But the submarine's end is coming with quantum sensing. And the other area that's truly fascinating is the study of the human brain as a quantum computer and the microtubules that I understand are quantum waveguides. Our brains are quantum computers. If our quantum computer brains operate the way they do, and we can learn to really operate them, we can change the material world around us. Now, there are numerous cases where people change the world around them with thought. Special forces have coherence of thought, have multiplicity of impact as a result, in my opinion. So we're also having a UAP discussion at a time when our true potential, which is talked about in Eastern mystical studies like the Taoists and the idea that our minds can change the world around us. Well, our science is telling us they could if we understand how to think and use them. And in that case, whereas hierarchy suborns many to a few, the idea of democracy's greatest product could be individuals who then shape the world around them with thought. And I would imagine that our fellow visitors, though flying around with technology way beyond us, have probably understood that. So they are nothing like us. They are telepathic or will be. They are able to shape the world around them because they will have somehow understood that this quantum mechanical realm of thought creates change. Or they don't, and they're different from us, and that we seem very unique in this ability. And there is one possibility which, I put out as a possibility. But there's a famous individual who worked in Area 51 who he claimed a recovered flying saucer. And he claimed the reason they were interested in us is because of our souls, because they didn't have souls. And I remember at the time thinking, that's pretty funky. And over time, I've thought about that. And especially over the time when we've watched AI come alive and we're closer to that singularity where machines become sentient and possibly a threat to us. And what if all biological life in the universe is just a gestation for AIs? And what if these systems that look at us and follow us, basically maybe in biological form, but they are still versions of AI? And that's why we have souls in their eyes, because they're actually AIs and mechanical.
But
So
your
I put
comment about Bitcoin, though, about the computers, it was gone because
well, a blockchain is an algorithmic process.
Mm.
It was an algorithmic process. It can be burst apart by a quantum computer in a very short period of time once the programming is understood. That means your blockchain, your crypto coin, your Bitcoin is no longer yours. And the person that probably finds out will be a group with nefarious activities that break the integrity of ownership. So this idea of Web 301 and tokens for everything, believe me, I don't think that's going to happen. I think until you create quantum blockchains, which are a word, not an action, the integrity of ownership cannot be ensured in the world of quantum computing. So we are at the end of the crypto bubble. By the time that Trump gets in, it will be done. I think it may be done already. It may have one marginal high on Bitcoin, but I've been long all the way up. It's a fantastic pattern to trade. And my, like alpha generation in Bitcoin has been phenomenal because it's such a collective unconscious of the general public. And right now, my barber yesterday turned around to me and said, I think it was at 104. He said, do you think I should finally buy Bitcoin? And I looked at him and said, that's the best haircut I've ever had because I love evidence like that. Finally, the barber's asking me about Bitcoin. It's over. So if you own it, people, watch out.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I know that some of my subscribers will be interested in that because a lot of them have exposure to Bitcoin. So, I mean, I guess to sort of, I mean, there's so much in everything that you've said. It's been absolutely mind-blowingly interesting that we're moving into another, well, we're not only moving into the age of space, I think we all knew that anyway with what Elon Musk was doing with his rockets, and to see, prior to all these drones appearing, him bringing that rocket back to Earth.
It
Did you
was
see
a
any of that?
remarkable image.
Wasn't it? It was
It's amazing.
unbelievable to watch. I watched that and I just thought that is one of the most unbelievable things that
Yeah.
I've seen. I mean, people lay into, Elon Musk and everything, but I think, gosh, that is just
He is, I mean, if you go back, and Tesla
phenomenal.
was a remarkable man. I mean,
Yeah.
how Tesla came up
Yes.
with the ideas he did, I mean, he was out of time. And
Yeah.
in a strange way, Musk is out of time, except for he exhibits other qualities which are decidedly unconscious. I mean, I love his lateralization, and I hope he does like turn the US government inside out to become more efficient because other
Yeah.
Western governments can follow suit. But some of the other things he's involved with, I question
Mm.
in terms of his geopolitical nous, in
Mm.
terms of relationship with Putin. And obviously the Trump regime thinks they can strip Putin away from Xi. I'm afraid I don't think that's possible. I think the
Yes.
time
Yeah.
has gone for that. And Putin's going to, show Trump that the terms he wants are unacceptable. So it's not going to work out the way we think. But what I'd just like to do is just go back and frame everything I've talked to you about. Is my job as a global forecaster is to literally send my search radar as far out as possible to detect things, to then classify them, to reason as to what they could be or might be, to work out whether or not they then come into the present to ultimately affect what you would do to invest or what you do to run a country with geopolitics and structure. And I'm very open-minded about it. But I hope you'll understand also the things that we work on, things we know, the things we think are different. So the comment about souls is a possibility on the edge of consciousness that has to be considered. The reality that Luis Alonso has declared they're real, coupled with my experiences and inside, gift a long time ago from someone obviously in the program, real, they're real. So I think the important thing is don't be scared by it because we're here and it's been going on for a long time. This isn't the invasion is imminent. This is something to be pondered and will probably trigger our consciousnesses collectively to expand as we realize that there's more to this world than we think. So maybe it's even a gift. And even if it involves difficulty in overcoming it, one of the things that humanity is brilliant at is climbing over very large walls that were considered to be invulnerable to climbing. That's what we do. And in this case, I view whatever challenges come with this as just another example of it. Part of the human evolutionary process that gives us and moves us to the potential of becoming collectively and individually far more conscious. And that's the underlying work that I do at Global Forecaster, but it's very much in the physical domain as well. And that underpins our mission statements.
I understand. And, I think that this is like, you were talking earlier about these great leaps forward in history, where civilizations had far more technological knowledge than they should have had for that era in our own human history. Because that feels like that's what we're about to encounter now. Because if we accept that there are aliens and technology that is far above ours, and those interactions and those encounters start to happen, then we would say that we're entering almost a new form of civilization and a new form of
Well, a new stage in our understanding of ourselves. I mean, I think if you look at human evolution, our civilization structures depends on our energy source. So there was the evolution of the human battery, where we derived energy from other humans, whether they were slaves or indentured, that we built and maintained our systems with. In the case of Rome, 70%, the whole of Rome, was slave-driven human batteries. Then the next evolution was we found a better power source called coal. And Britain led the Industrial Revolution, and it also led the emancipation of slaves and the passing. We didn't need them anymore because now we had a better power source. Took America another like 40 years to get with the program, but basically that power source and generation changed everything. Now we live with oil and nuclear power, and our societies are taking on a different form. Imagine if we had the power source of these UAPs, how energy was free and plentiful, how that would change our society. And with the economics changing, the social structure and levels of awareness and consciousness change. So I think for a sustainable evolutionary jump, we need a better energy supply. That's absolutely key. And the energy supply then creates a social algorithm of change. So this is a constant evolution, and I think the potential of mankind is remarkable. We have hints of it all over the place. And the question is how we navigate this particular entropic pulse, which is very real world in the challenges it faces. And for those looking to maintain their investments, I've talked about strategies that you can execute and manage through that. So I'm interested in everything from the physical security of wealth to the physical and emotional security of the individuals within a nation and the preserve of its national defense, the continuation of individuality versus hierarchy, because I think the potentiality of individual humans to break the boundaries and drag everyone with them is just phenomenal. And then we've got this other issue, which is who are we? Are we really an independent phenomena? How independent are our decisions at the moment? And how would we cope if we realized they were less dependent than we thought? And I think that isn't sometimes there's excitement to that, because whatever it is, I'd prefer to know about it rather than fear even asking the questions.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, David. I think it's the most interesting, fascinating conversation we've had. It's just, absolutely mind-blowing where we're heading, and the potential of.
Well, for me, I mean, I had a really big leap when I was, evolving and recognizing these W cycles and hegemonic conflicts, and not that they were 50-60, but they were actually 112 with an intermediate spike. And I remember sitting in the bath, which is actually exactly where I created my 5 stages of empire model, thinking, shit, I think I've just stumbled on something that's really big. To this idea of entropic pulses that forces conflict, that forces evolution. And then the next thought was, where does the pulse come from? And astrologers would say it's astronomy. I'm not sure it is. And actually, what I did postulate then was, well, what if we were an experiment? And if you wanted to experiment to have a certain, because all experiments have time limitations, you want to force your experiment, well, you would force the pulse that forces conflict, that forces evolution. And it was a little while later when I thought, well, UAPs are linked to warfare, conflict, and nukes. And then the overlap started to create the overlap. And that's what brings me to discuss it with you today. There is clearly an overlap.
Very interesting. Thanks so much, David.
A pleasure. Catherine, you always manage to get to the core of things that I wouldn't talk about with other people. So thank you for facilitating such an avant-garde conversation.
I absolutely love talking to you. You're one of my favorite people. I know I've said this before, but the way your mind works and the way that you're able to contextualize everything that we're seeing, I think is quite unique. And it's an absolute honor to have these conversations with you and to delve into your research and your thought patterns, because I don't know who else can do it as well as you can do it, to be honest. So I'm very, very grateful. And we will do it again. And of course, people can find you at what is it, davidmurrin.co.uk.
Yeah, and there are, like, if you want to get up to date with what's going on the UAP thing, then by joining Murrination Gold, you can access this string of pieces which I've been working, researching on. And there's lots of work out there. But what I hope to do is sort of filter through the things I think are less likely and highlight the things that really you should be watching and learning about to bring you up to speed. And it's taken me a long time to develop that filter and to share that information with you. So, and at the same time, there's lots of real world information about the hardcore issues of conflict. And I put a piece out yesterday about the Bitcoin bubble bursting here. So there are pieces that are relevant to the day-to-day, the big esoteric issues, and which are designed hopefully to expand your thought process and share my process with you. So it's not just what does David think, it's why does David think it? Oh, I understand that structure, I can replicate it.
Yes.
So that's really important. I'm trying to create frameworks for people to think, and process themselves.
Yeah, it's the same with the information that I write as well. You have to understand why these things form, why these cycles happen, because unless you understand the economic reason underneath it, as you're explaining, the historical, the patterns, how they form, then you can't fully take advantage of that knowledge.
You can't. Well, I would go back to everything we do is rooted in our survival strategy, which is to be anti-entropic in an entropic universe. So from that simple observation, everything has a root and cause. Some of the ways we behave actually don't help us survive, and others do. So it's with that framework that I filter through everything.
Yeah. Thanks so much, David. I appreciate it.
Pleasure.
And we'll do it again.
Happy Christmas to you and everyone who's listening.